My son didn't want me to meet his fiancée, and said it was better if I didn't come to the wedding, so I followed him one day to see what he was hiding. When I saw her face, my heart nearly stopped. It was... Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. Retirement, I'd been told, was a quiet harbor after a long and turbulent voyage. For me, Vivian Sterling, it was a Brooklyn brownstone, a sanctuary of silent, sun-drenched rooms where the ghosts of my past were kept at bay by the comforting weight of 1,000 books. For 30 years my world had been the cacophony of the New York City Police Department, the final 15 of which were spent in the grim, shadowed trenches of the Special Victims Unit. My life had been a litany of sirens, of whispered confessions and sterile interrogation rooms, of the hollow-eyed stares of people whose worlds had been fractured by violence. Now, the loudest sound was often the gentle clink of my teaspoon against a porcelain mug, the rhythmic rustle of newspaper pages, or the distant muffled symphony of the city that I had once policed with a relentless, weary vigilance. My house was my fortress of peace. Each object was a testament to a life lived outside the chalk outlines and the yellow tape. The Persian rug in the living room, its colors muted by a century of footsteps, was a purchase made on a rare, carefree weekend. The abstract oil painting above the mantelpiece, a chaotic swirl of blues and grays, was the work of a street artist I'd admired in the village. These were not just things, they were anchors grounding me in a reality that was soft and quiet, and blessedly mundane. The skills I had honed over a lifetime, however, were not so easily retired. You can take the detective out of the precinct, but you can never truly take the precinct out of the detective. My observational habits remained, a kind of muscle memory that refused to atrophy. I still found myself scanning a room when I entered it, noting the exits, the subtle shifts in a person's posture, the flicker of an eye that betrayed a thought. I would sit on a park bench and mentally reconstruct the life stories of passers-by, based on the scuff marks on their shoes or the way they held their shoulders. It was a game I played, a way to keep the blade of my mind from dulling, but it was also a constant low-humming reminder of the woman I used to be. The quiet of my life was not an emptiness. It was filled completely and utterly by my son Michael. He was the sun around which my new, smaller universe revolved. At 36, he was a man forged in a crucible of his own making, a world away from the one I had inhabited. He was a chef, a creator, the proprietor of a celebrated restaurant in Soho called Aperture, a place where food was not just sustenance but an art form. He painted with flavors, sculpted with textures. His hands, which were strong and sure, could craft a dish so beautiful it seemed a crime to eat it. He had his father's kind heart and artistic soul, a gentle spirit that had always been a source of both my greatest pride and my deepest, most private fear. I had spent my life in the company of monsters, and I knew how easily a gentle spirit could be broken by the world's casual cruelty. He was the one case I could never close, the one person whose safety and happiness remained my ultimate, ongoing responsibility. Our relationship was the bedrock of my existence, a bond of deep, unspoken understanding. He knew the darkness I had waded through, and I knew the light he was determined to create. But even in the peaceful harbor of my retirement, I could feel the old currents tugging at me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I would be jolted awake by the ghost of a ringing phone, my heart pounding with the expectation of a call from the precinct, of a new case, a new victim, a new puzzle to be solved. The instincts, the gut feelings that had kept me alive and had put countless predators behind bars, were still there, lying dormant, just beneath the serene surface of my new life. I told myself I was done, that my watch was o'er. I told myself that the only mysteries I had left to solve were the Sunday crossword and the occasional whodunit novel. I had convinced myself that I was just a mother now, a quiet, retired woman living in a book-filled brownstone in Brooklyn. I had no idea that my most important case, the one that would threaten the very foundation of my world, was about to walk, silently and invisibly, right through my front door. Michael visited on a Tuesday, the kind of crisp, brilliant autumn afternoon that makes you believe the world is a place of infinite possibility. He didn't call first, but he didn't need to. He had a key, and his arrivals were always a welcome disruption to the quiet rhythm of my days. I heard the familiar sound of the front door opening, his footsteps on the old hardwood floors, and then his voice full of a bright, buoyant energy that seemed to light up the whole house. "Mom? You here?" I was in the kitchen, attempting to coax an orchid back to life. I turned, a smile already on my face, and saw him standing in the doorway. He was glowing. It was the only word for it. He seemed to radiate a kind of pure, unadulterated happiness that was so potent it was almost a physical presence in the room. His dark hair was a little messy, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his chef's jacket was unbuttoned. But it was his eyes that held me. They were shining with a light I hadn't seen in them since he was a little boy on Christmas morning. "Michael," I said, putting down my watering can, "what is it? You look like you just won the lottery." He laughed, a full, uninhibited sound that echoed in the quiet kitchen. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, and wrapped me in a hug, lifting me off my feet for a moment. "Better," he said, his voice muffled in my hair. "So much better." He set me down, his hands still on my shoulders, his grin so wide it seemed to take up his whole face. "Mom," he began, taking a deep breath as if to steady himself against the force of his own joy. "I'm getting married." The words hung in the air for a moment, beautiful and fragile. A wave of pure maternal joy washed over me, so intense it left me momentarily speechless. This was it. The moment I had hoped for, dreamed of. My son, my wonderful, kind and brilliant son, had found his person. "Oh, Michael," I finally managed, my own voice thick with emotion. That's wonderful news. I'm so happy for you." We hugged again, a long, tight embrace that communicated everything words could not. When we finally pulled apart, my eyes were wet. "Tell me everything," I said, pulling him towards the kitchen table. "Who is she? What's her name? How did you meet?" He sat down, his entire body thrumming with a restless energy. "Her name is Gabrielle," he said, and the way he spoke her name was a reverence, a prayer. "Gabrielle Dubois. Gabby. And she's incredible, Mom. She's just everything." He went on to describe her in a breathless, almost poetic rush of words. "She was an art consultant," he said, "brilliant and cultured. They had met at a gallery opening a few months ago, a chance encounter that had felt," he said, "like destiny." He spoke of her wit, her intelligence, her passion for life, her kindness. He painted a picture of a woman who was not just perfect, but perfect for him. As I listened, my heart swelled with a happiness so profound it was almost painful. This was all I had ever wanted for him. "She sounds absolutely perfect," I said, my voice full of genuine warmth. "I cannot wait to meet her. We must have her over for dinner immediately. This weekend, I'll make my lasagna." It was a natural, instinctive response. The mother in me, the part of me that had hosted a lifetime of birthday parties and holiday dinners, was already planning the celebration, already mentally setting the table. And that was when the first, almost imperceptible shift occurred. The brilliant light in his eyes dimmed just a fraction. A subtle, fleeting tension tightened the corners of his mouth. "Well," he began, his voice losing some of its buoyant, effortless joy. "That's the thing, she's very private." I tilted my head, a small frown touching my lips. "Private? What do you mean?" He shifted in his chair, suddenly finding the pattern of the wooden tabletop intensely interesting. She's a very quiet person," he said, the words coming out a little too carefully. "She doesn't like big scenes. The idea of a big family dinner being the center of attention, it's a lot for her. She's not ready for that yet." The explanation felt thin. In my experience, even the most private people were willing to meet their future mother-in-law. It was a rite of passage, however awkward. But I pushed the thought away. I would not let a small, strange detail mar this perfect moment. "Of course," I said, forcing a bright smile. "I understand. We can do something smaller. Just the 3 of us. Here, or at your restaurant. Whatever she's comfortable with." He looked up and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Relief, but also a kind of strained apology. "Thanks, Mom. That would be better. But maybe not just yet. Let's just give it a little time. I want to make sure she's comfortable, you know?" He stood up then, the conversation suddenly and very deliberately over. He gave me another quick hug, promised to call me the next day, and then he was gone, leaving a trail of his radiant happiness, now tinged with a faint, inexplicable note of something else. Something I couldn't quite name. I stood alone in my quiet kitchen, the joy of his announcement still warming my heart, but a new cold little seed of confusion had been planted. It was a small thing, a tiny, almost insignificant detail, but in my world, the world I had just retired from, it was always the small, insignificant details that ended up mattering the most. The days that followed were a strange mixture of happiness and a low, persistent hum of unease. I replayed our conversation in my mind, dissecting it with the practiced, almost unconscious skill of a seasoned detective. Michael's initial unadulterated joy had been real. I was certain of that, but his evasiveness about Gabrielle had also been real. The two things didn't quite fit together. I tried to reason with myself to silence the suspicious voice in my head. I was retired. I was a mother, not an investigator. This was Michael's life, his relationship, and I had to trust his judgment. Gabrielle was probably just shy, an introvert overwhelmed by the prospect of meeting the woman who had raised the man she loved. It was a plausible explanation, but it didn't feel true. It felt like a line he had been fed, a story he was telling not just me but perhaps himself as well. The call came 2 weeks later on a Thursday evening. I was reading in my study, the house silent around me, when my phone rang. I saw Michael's name on the screen and answered with a warm, "Hello, darling." His response was not the usual easy warmth I was used to. His voice was tight, strained, laced with a nervous energy that set my teeth on edge. "Hey, Mom," he said. "You got a minute?" "Of course," I said, closing my book. "Is everything all right? You sound stressed." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a beat of static-filled silence that felt heavy with unspoken words. "Everything's fine," he said, though his tone suggested the exact opposite. "It's just, well, Gabby and we've made a decision. We don't want a big wedding, all the fuss, the planning, it's not us. So we're just going to go down to City Hall, next week. Just the two of us, keep it simple." My heart sank a little. I had, of course, been dreaming of his wedding day, of a church filled with family and friends, of seeing him standing at the altar, but it was his day, his choice. "Oh," I said, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. "Well, that's certainly simple. I'm a little sad I won't get to see you all dressed up, but if that's what makes you both happy, then I'm happy for you." I assumed naturally that just the two of us was a figure of speech, that a mother was an exception to the rule. I was wrong. "Thanks, Mom," he said, and the relief in his voice was so profound it was almost a gasp. "And that's the other thing I needed to talk to you about." He hesitated again, and I could hear him take a deep, shaky breath. "About the wedding, about you being there. We were talking, Gabby and we just think it would be better if you didn't come." The words hit me with a physical force, a punch to the gut that knocked the air from my lungs. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, utterly speechless. My own son was uninviting me from his wedding. The rejection was so absolute, so profoundly hurtful, that my mind couldn't even begin to process it. "Michael," I finally managed to whisper, my voice a raw, broken thing. "What are you talking about? Why?" He started talking then, the words tumbling out in a rushed, defensive and deeply rehearsed-sounding torrent. "It's not about you, Mom, I swear. It's Gabby. She's had a really difficult life, a deeply traumatic past, things I can't even tell you about, and she's just now starting to feel safe, to build a new life with me." He took another breath. "And your past, your career, it's intimidating for her. The idea of her new mother-in-law being a detective from the Special Victims Unit, it's just too much. It brings up too much for her. It would be less stressful for her, for both of us, if we just did this on our own. Please, Mom, try to understand." I listened, my shock slowly, chillingly, being replaced by a cold, dreadful clarity. The explanation was elaborate. It was specific. It was, to my trained ears, utterly and completely preposterous. A woman so traumatized by the idea of a retired cop that she would ban her from her own son's wedding. It wasn't just an excuse. It was a work of fiction, a carefully crafted narrative designed for a single purpose, to keep me away. This wasn't Gabrielle's shyness. This was a deliberate, strategic act of exclusion, and my son, my kind, loving and deeply loyal son, was her mouthpiece. He was being used, manipulated into inflicting a wound on his own mother that he couldn't possibly comprehend. The mother in me was shattered, heartbroken by the cruelty of his words. But the detective, the woman who had spent a lifetime listening to lies, was wide awake, and she was furious. After the call ended, I didn't move. I sat in the deepening twilight of my study, the phone still clutched in my hand, the silence of the room roaring in my ears. The initial searing pain of Michael's words began to recede, replaced by a feeling I knew all too well. It was the cold, sharp and utterly unmistakable certainty that I was being lied to. It was a sensation that started deep in my gut, a tight, coiling knot of intuition that had been honed over 3 decades of interrogations, of listening to the carefully constructed alibis of guilty men. I could feel it now, as strongly as I ever had in room 2B at the 17th precinct. This was not the truth. It was a performance. My mind, acting on pure, ingrained instinct, began to do what it had always done. It pushed the emotion aside and started to analyze the data. I replayed Michael's words, not as a heartbroken mother but as a detective evaluating a witness statement. The phrasing was key. Deeply traumatic past. The words were generic, theatrical, the kind of language people use in movies, not in real life. Intimidated by your past. It was too perfect, too convenient. The excuse wasn't just an explanation, it was a weapon designed to be unchallengeable. How could I argue against a faceless, nameless trauma? How could I defend myself against the ghost of my own career? It was a brilliant manipulative checkmate. The story was a fabrication, but it was a clever one. It played on Michael's best qualities, his kindness, his protective instincts, his desire to be the hero for the woman he loved. Gabrielle, this woman I had never met, had painted herself as a damsel in distress, a fragile creature who needed to be shielded from the world, and most specifically from me. She had identified me as a threat, and had engineered a way to neutralize me, using my own son as the instrument of my exile. The sheer audacity of it, the cold, calculating cruelty was breathtaking. This was not the work of a shy, traumatized woman. This was the work of a predator. A deep, primal fear began to uncoil within me, a fear not for my own wounded feelings, but for Michael. He wasn't just in love. He was under a spell. He was being managed, controlled, isolated from the one person in his life who had always been his fiercest protector. The detective in me, the part of me I had tried so hard to put to rest, was now fully and irrevocably awake. My quiet brownstone no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a command center. The hurt was still there, a dull throbbing ache in my chest, but it was being rapidly consumed by a cold, familiar fury. I stood up and began to pace the room, the worn Persian rug a track for my restless energy. My instincts weren't just screaming, they were sounding a 5-alarm fire. The woman my son was about to marry was a liar, and if she was lying about this, what else was she lying about? Her name, her past as an art consultant, her love for my son. I walked over to my desk and looked at a framed photograph of Michael as a boy, a gap-toothed 7-year-old with a soccer ball tucked under his arm and a world of trust in his eyes. I had protected that boy with every fiber of my being. I had worked nights, I had missed school plays, I had stared into the face of human evil, all to ensure that he could grow up in a world that was safe, a world where he could be the kind, trusting man he was today. And now, that very trust was being used as a weapon against him. I realized, with a chilling certainty, that my work was not done. I had one last case to solve. I had to find out who Gabrielle Dubois really was. I had to uncover the truth, not for my own sake, not to salve my own wounded pride, but to protect my son from the invisible danger that was about to become his wife. The mother was heartbroken, but the detective had just been given her mission. The decision, when it came, was not a decision at all. It was an inevitability, a clicking into place of a mechanism that had been dormant for too long. My training, my experience, my very identity was reasserting itself, pushing aside the grief and confusion of the past few weeks. The hurt of Michael's rejection was a luxury I could no longer afford. My son was walking, blind and happy, into a carefully constructed trap, and I was the only person who could see the steel jaws waiting to snap shut. Confronting him was out of the question. He was too deeply enmeshed, too thoroughly convinced of Gabrielle's narrative of victimhood. A direct accusation would be dismissed as the jealous ramblings of a scorned mother. It would drive a wedge between us so deep, it might never be repaired, and it would only serve to isolate him further. No, I could not fight this battle with emotion. I had to fight it with facts, cold, hard, and irrefutable facts. My study, which had been my peaceful retreat, transformed back into an investigation room. I cleared a space on my large oak desk, pushing aside stacks of novels and gardening magazines. I unearthed a box from the back of a closet, a dusty cardboard time capsule filled with the relics of my former life. Inside were old notebooks, spare handcuffs, and a small, powerful pair of binoculars. Holding them in my hands felt like shaking hands with a ghost. They felt heavier than I remembered, weighted with the memory of 100 stakeouts, of long, cold nights spent watching and waiting for a single crucial mistake. I sat at my desk and opened a fresh, clean notebook. At the top of the first page I wrote the name Gabrielle Dubois. Below it I wrote everything I knew about her, which was, I realized with a grim sense of purpose, almost nothing. Art consultant, met Michael at a gallery, private, traumatic past. It was a biography as thin and flimsy as a stage prop. My first step, I decided, would be surveillance. It was the most fundamental tool of any investigation. I needed to see her. I needed to observe her in her natural habitat, to watch her with Michael when she thought no one was looking, when her guard was down. I needed to see if the woman he described, the shy, fragile creature, matched the reality. My gut told me it wouldn't. I needed to see her face, to study her mannerisms, to listen to the cadence of her voice. If I could get close enough. The human element was everything. A database could give you records, but only your own two eyes could show you the truth of a person. The next morning, I called Michael. It was one of the most difficult calls I have ever had to make. I forced a warmth and contrition into my voice that I did not feel. I told him that I had been thinking about our conversation, that I had been selfish and that I was sorry. I told him that I understood, that all I wanted was his happiness, and that if this was what he and Gabrielle needed, then I would respect their wishes. The relief that flooded his voice was a fresh, sharp stab of pain, but I bore it. It was a necessary deception. He was so grateful, so happy that I was on board, that he became chatty, voluble. He told me he was taking Gabby to a celebratory lunch that afternoon, to toast their new stress-free wedding plans. He mentioned the name of the restaurant, a trendy new place in Chelsea. It was a careless mistake on his part, born of his relief. For me it was the first break in the case. I spent the next few hours preparing. I chose my clothes with care. A simple gray pantsuit, comfortable shoes, a scarf to partially obscure my face. I was not Vivian Sterling, retired mother. I was a shadow, an anonymous woman in a city of millions. I dug out an old nondescript tote bag, into which I placed my binoculars, a bottle of water, a notepad, and a camera with a telephoto lens, another relic from my box of ghosts. As I assembled my gear, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The confusion and the hurt had been burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear sense of purpose. I was back in my element. The streets of New York were my precinct, and I was a detective again, on the hunt. The target was the woman who was trying to steal my son. The city felt different that day. Sharper, more defined. As I drove from Brooklyn into Manhattan, the familiar landmarks seemed to stand out in stark relief, the way a crime scene does when you first arrive. Every detail suddenly imbued with a terrible significance. My senses were heightened, my mind clear and focused. The adrenaline, a long-forgotten friend, was a low, steady hum in my veins. This was not a mother going to lunch. This was a detective on a mission. I parked my car a few blocks from the Chelsea restaurant Michael had mentioned, a chic, glass-fronted establishment with a line of expensive cars idling at the curb. I found a small coffee shop directly across the street, a perfect vantage point. I chose a small table by the window, ordered a black coffee I had no intention of drinking, and settled in to wait. The tools of my old trade felt natural in my hands. The weight of the binoculars, the smooth, cool metal of the camera. It was a strange, unsettling kind of homecoming. I had spent countless hours like this, in cars, in anonymous coffee shops, in darkened apartments, watching and waiting. It was a job that consisted of long stretches of intense boredom punctuated by moments of pure, heart-stopping terror, or revelation. Today, I didn't know which to expect. An hour later I saw Michael's car pull up. He got out and handed the keys to the valet, a wide, happy smile on his face. He looked like a man without a care in the world, a man deeply and confidently in love. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at his phone, and then his face lit up. A taxi had pulled up behind his car, and from it emerged a woman. My breath caught in my throat. I raised the binoculars, my hands steady, my movements slow and practiced. The woman who stepped onto the curb was not the shy, fragile creature Michael had described. She was a vision of effortless, predatory elegance. She was tall and slender, dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored cream-colored suit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon, and a pair of oversized sunglasses concealed her eyes. She moved with a liquid, confident grace, a woman entirely comfortable in her own skin, a woman used to being looked at. Michael rushed to her side, and she greeted him with a bright, dazzling smile and a quick, almost performative kiss. There was nothing private or retiring about her. She commanded the space around her, drawing the eyes of every person on the sidewalk. She looked, I thought with a cold, sinking feeling, like a queen, and my son looked like her most devoted and most blind subject. They went inside, Through the large plate glass window of the restaurant, I could see them being led to a prime table. I watched through my binoculars as they talked. She was animated, her hands gesturing gracefully as she spoke. She would lean in close to Michael, touch his arm, laugh at something he said. It was a masterful performance of intimacy and affection. But even from across the street, I could see the cracks in the facade. Her smiles, I noticed, didn't always reach her eyes. Her gaze would occasionally flicker away from Michael, scanning the restaurant with a quick, almost bird-like motion, an unconscious assessment of her surroundings. It was the subtle, restless watchfulness of a hunter, or of the hunted. I took a few pictures, the click of the shutter a small, satisfying sound in the noisy coffee shop. I knew these images might be useless, but the act of documenting, of gathering evidence, was ingrained in me. After an hour they emerged, still smiling, still looking like the perfect couple. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and Michael hailed her a taxi. Another kiss, this one a little longer, a little more for show. As he held the taxi door open for her, he said something that made her laugh. It was then that she took off her sunglasses, and for the first time I saw her eyes. They were a cool, intelligent, and utterly unreadable shade of blue. She got into the taxi, and was gone. Michael stood on the curb, watching her taxi disappear, a look of pure unadulterated adoration on his face. He was completely and utterly lost. I paid for my coffee, my hand trembling slightly. I had seen her. I had observed her, and my gut feeling, the one that had been screaming at me for weeks, was now a deafening, terrifying roar. Nothing about this woman was what it seemed. I followed Michael back to his restaurant in Soho. He moved through his day with the cheerful, focused energy of a man who believes his life is perfect. I watched from my car parked a block away as he oversaw his kitchen staff, as he charmed his lunchtime patrons. He was in his element, a master of his own small, delicious world. My heart ached for him. He was living in a beautiful, fragile dream, and I was the one who was going to have to wake him up. Late in the afternoon he emerged from the restaurant, dressed now in casual clothes. He got on his phone, and I saw him smile as he spoke. He was talking to her. He hung up, got in his car and began to drive. This was not the route to his apartment. This was different. My instincts, now fully engaged, told me this was important. I followed at a discreet distance, my old skills coming back to me as if I had used them only yesterday. He drove uptown towards Chelsea, a neighborhood of art galleries, chic boutiques, and expensive anonymous hotels. He pulled into the underground garage of the Crimson, a sleek, minimalist hotel known for its discretion and its wealthy clientele. This was not where Gabrielle lived. This was a temporary place, a place for secrets. I parked across the street and waited. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. The city's lights began to flicker on, a billion tiny stars in the urban constellation. A feeling of profound dread settled over me. What was my son doing at a hotel like this? I pulled out my binoculars again, my hands now slick with a nervous sweat. The hotel had a stylish, low-lit bar on the ground floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a clear, unobstructed view of the interior. I focused my lenses on the entrance. A few minutes later, Michael walked into the bar. He chose a secluded table in the corner, and ordered a drink. He sat there, nursing his whiskey, a look of quiet, happy anticipation on his face. He was waiting for her. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Just as I was beginning to think she wouldn't show, she appeared. She walked into the bar, not with the tentative air of a shy woman, but with the confidence of a predator entering her hunting ground. She was dressed in a simple, elegant black dress, her hair down now, falling in dark waves around her shoulders. She scanned the room, her cool blue eyes missing nothing, and then she saw Michael. A warm, brilliant smile transformed her face, and she glided towards his table. I watched them talk. I was too far away to hear their words, but I could see the story in their gestures. I saw the way she leaned in, her eyes locked on his, making him feel like he was the only person in the world. I saw the way he relaxed, his whole body seeming to soften in her presence. She was a master, a virtuoso of manipulation. She was playing him like a finely tuned instrument, and he had no idea he was being played. Then, it happened. She laughed at something he said, a bright, musical sound that I could imagine but not hear. She threw her head back, and as she did, she turned her face towards the large window, towards the street, towards me. The light from inside the bar illuminated her features with a sudden, stark clarity. I zoomed the binoculars in, my fingers tightening on the focus wheel, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. In that moment, time seemed to fracture, to bend and collapse in on itself. The past and the present slammed together with the force of a physical collision. The polished, elegant woman in the black dress dissolved. And in her place, I saw another face, a ghost from a decade ago, a face that had haunted the dark corners of my memory for years. My breath hitched in my throat. The binoculars slipped from my numb fingers. My heart nearly stopped. It was her. 10 years ago, the memory rose up unbidden and unwelcome, with the vivid, sickening clarity of a recurring nightmare. I wasn't Vivian Sterling, Brooklyn retiree. I was Detective Sterling, 17th Precinct, SVU, and I was standing in the opulent, violated living room of a penthouse on the Upper East Side. The air was thick with the scent of fear and expensive cologne. The victim, Alistair Finch, a man of 75, a kind, recently widowed art collector, was sitting on a silk-covered chaise, a blanket draped over his shaking shoulders. His face was a canvas of purple and blue bruises, his left eye swollen shut. But it was the look in his one good eye that I remember most clearly, a devastating cocktail of shame, terror and profound soul-deep betrayal. The case had started, as so many did, in the lonely landscape of the internet. Mr. Finch, grieving the loss of his wife of 50 years, had sought companionship on a high-end dating site for distinguished singles. It was there he had met Angelica Rose. She was, he had told us, a revelation. She was young, beautiful, intelligent, with a passion for impressionist art that matched his own. Her profile had been a masterpiece of curated perfection, her photographs ethereal and alluring. They had exchanged emails, then phone calls. She had been charming, attentive, seemingly captivated by his stories of a life well lived. She had made him feel, he had whispered, his voice cracking, young again. After a month of careful, patient seduction, she had agreed to come to his apartment for dinner. He had been ecstatic. He had bought champagne. He had ordered from his favorite restaurant. She had arrived looking, he said, like an angel. She had been perfect, too perfect. They had talked for hours. She had listened, her eyes full of a deep and utterly fraudulent sympathy. At some point she had refilled his champagne glass. That was the last thing he clearly remembered. He had woken up hours later, his head throbbing, his body aching, to the sound of his safe being drilled open in his study. When he had staggered in, he had found not just Angelica but a man, large and brutal, who had been waiting for him. Mr. Finch, a man of pride and old-world courage, had tried to fight back. The man had beaten him, methodically and viciously, while Angelica, he remembered with a sob, had simply watched, her angelic face a mask of cold, impatient indifference. They had taken everything, over $2 million in rare coins, jewelry that had belonged to his late wife, and every last dollar of his liquid assets, transferred from his accounts using the passwords she had so cleverly and so patiently extracted from him over weeks of intimate conversation. By the time he had managed to crawl to a phone and call for help, they were gone. They had vanished as if they had never existed. The investigation had been one of the most frustrating of my career. Angelica Rose was a ghost. Her online profile had been scrubbed, the IP address routed through a dozen untraceable servers. The name was an alias, the backstory a complete fabrication. We had a single grainy surveillance photo of her entering the lobby of Mr. Finch's building, her face partially obscured by a scarf. We had Mr. Finch's heartbroken, humiliated description, but we had nothing else. She had made no mistakes. She was a professional, a brilliant grifter who had honed her craft to a razor's edge. The case had haunted me. It wasn't just the financial ruin of a good man, or the violence he had endured. It was the sheer predatory cruelty of the crime. She hadn't just stolen his money. She had stolen his trust, his dignity, his faith in human connection. She had taken his grief and weaponized it against him. We had chased down 100 dead-end leads. We had interviewed a dozen other men who had been targeted by similar though less successful online romance scams. But we never found her. The case had eventually gone cold, relegated to a dusty file box in the archives, another unsolved story in a city full of them. But I had never forgotten her face. The one from the blurry photo, the one Mr. Finch had described with such agonizing detail. I had carried it with me, a professional failure, a ghost of justice denied. And now, 10 years later, that ghost was sitting in a chic Chelsea bar laughing with my son. The woman in the bar was older, of course. A decade had passed. The face was more polished, the youthful softness replaced by a sharp, sophisticated confidence. The hair, which had been blonde in the old case file, was now a deep lustrous brunette. The clothes, the makeup, the entire presentation was that of a different person, a woman of wealth and status, an art consultant at the top of her game. The disguise was nearly perfect, but a face, a real face, is more than just hair color and cosmetics. It's in the architecture, the bone structure, the precise distance between the eyes, the unique curve of a lip. And as I stared through the window, my detective's mind, the part of me trained to see past the superficial, to find the unchanging truth beneath the lies, made the connection with a certainty that was as absolute and as terrifying as a death sentence. Gabrielle Dubois was Angelica Rose. It was in the high, sharp cheekbones. It was in the elegant column of her neck. It was in the way her left eyebrow arched just slightly higher than her right, when she smiled. It was a detail Mr. Finch had mentioned, a tiny, unique characteristic that had lodged itself in my memory. I lowered the binoculars, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the coffee shop window, my mind reeling, trying to process the sheer, monstrous impossibility of it. Of all the people in the world, of all the con artists in a city built on ambition and reinvention, my son had found this one, the one from my past, the one who had gotten away. The pieces of the puzzle, the ones that had been troubling me for weeks, now slammed into place with a horrifying perfect logic. Her traumatic past, her shyness, her pathological need to avoid meeting me. It wasn't a story to protect her fragile psyche, it was a brilliant preemptive strike, a strategic masterpiece of manipulation designed for one specific purpose, to keep her away from the one person on the entire planet who could recognize her face and connect her to a violent, unsolved felony. She hadn't been intimidated by my past as an SVU detective in some vague abstract way. She had been terrified of it. She had known, from the moment Michael had told her what his mother used to do for a living, that I was the single greatest threat to her new life, to her latest and most ambitious con. My son. He wasn't just a lover she had happened to meet. He was the perfect cover. By embedding herself in his life, by preparing to marry him, she was acquiring not just his wealth and his status, but a powerful, invisible shield. Who would ever suspect that the fiancée of a celebrated chef, the future daughter-in-law of a decorated NYPD detective, was a fugitive from one of that detective's own cold cases? The irony was so profound, so deeply twisted it was almost poetic. She was hiding in plain sight, in the one place no one would ever think to look. My own family. I looked back across the street, at the happy couple in the window. They were laughing, toasting each other with their drinks. Michael looked besotted, his face full of a pure, unguarded love. And Gabrielle, or Angelica, or whoever she really was looking at him with an expression of fond, loving adoration. It was the best performance of her life. And my son was her captive audience of one. I stumbled out of the coffee shop and into the cool night air, my legs unsteady beneath me. The bustling Chelsea street, with its laughing crowds and its river of yellow taxis, seemed to blur and distort, the sounds of the city fading into a dull, distant roar. I walked for hours with no destination in mind, my feet carrying me through the familiar grid of Manhattan streets as my mind raced through the terrifying labyrinthine corridors of my discovery. Each step was a hammer blow, driving the awful truth deeper into my consciousness. My son, my beautiful trusting son, was engaged to a violent, sociopathic con artist, a woman I had hunted, a woman who had ruined an old man's life and had gotten away with it. I found myself standing on the edge of the Hudson River, staring out at the dark, churning water. The dilemma before me was a monster, a creature with two heads, each one promising a different kind of devastation. On the one hand, I could do my duty, I could be the detective, I could walk into the nearest precinct, lay out my evidence, and have her arrested. I could reopen the cold case, deliver the justice that had been denied to Alistair Finch for a decade. It was the right thing to do, it was the only thing to do. But it would come at a terrible, unimaginable cost. It would mean shattering my son's world. It would mean taking a sledgehammer to the beautiful life he believed he was building. He would see me not as his protector but as his destroyer. He would see my actions as a betrayal, a monstrous act of jealousy and control. The man he was now so full of love and hope would be replaced by a man full of bitterness, heartbreak, and a deep, abiding resentment for his own mother. I might save him from her, but I would lose him in the process. On the other hand, I could do nothing. I could be the mother. I could swallow this terrible secret, choke down the bile of my knowledge, and stand by in silence as my son married a dangerous criminal. I could watch him merge his life, his finances, his future with a woman who saw him as nothing more than a mark, a tool, a means to an end. I could live with the constant gnawing fear of what she was capable of. The original crime had involved a violent male accomplice. Was he still in the picture? Was Michael's physical safety at risk? If I stayed silent, I would be protecting his heart in the short term, but I would be condemning him to a life built on a foundation of lies. A life where he was perpetually at risk of being drained of his money, his reputation and his spirit. It was an impossible choice, a mother's terrible, agonizing choice. To save his future, I had to destroy his present. To protect him, I had to inflict upon him the greatest pain of his life. I walked home across the Brooklyn Bridge. The iconic skyline of the city I had sworn to protect spread out before me. The choice was never really a choice at all. I was, and always had been, a detective. It was not just a job, it was the very core of my being, and I was, and always would be, Michael's mother. The two identities which had often been in conflict were now perfectly terrifyingly aligned. The detective's duty to pursue justice and the mother's duty to protect her child had merged into a single clear and unavoidable path. I could not let him marry her. I could not stand by and watch this happen. I had to expose her. But how? A simple accusation even from me might not be enough. He was too far under her spell. I needed more than just my memory. I needed proof. I needed the file. I needed to reopen the coldest case of my life. The next morning, I drove to the 17th precinct. The moment I walked through the doors, a flood of memories washed over me. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. The constant chaotic symphony of ringing phones and shouted conversations. The sight of the weary, determined faces of the men and women I had once called my family. It felt like a lifetime ago. A few of the older cops recognized me, their faces breaking into surprised smiles. "Vivian, what the hell are you doing here? Got tired of the quiet life?" I managed a weak smile, shaking hands, accepting a hug from my old desk sergeant. But I was not there for a social call, I was there for a ghost. I found my old partner, Dave Miller, in his cluttered, cramped office, hunched over a mountain of paperwork. He was grayer now, more tired, but the same sharp, intelligent light was in his eyes. He looked up as I entered, and a slow, genuine grin spread across his face. "Viv, as I live and breathe," he said, standing up to give me a hug. "To what do I owe the honor? Don't tell me you're unretiring. We could use you." "I wish it were that simple, Dave," I said, my voice low. "I need a favor, a big one. Off the books." His smile faded, replaced by the serious, focused expression of a working detective. He knew the tone of my voice. He had heard it 1,000 times before at 1,000 different crime scenes. "What do you need?" he asked, gesturing for me to sit down. I took a deep breath. "I need you to pull a cold case file for me, from SVU. About 10 years back, the Angelica Rose case." Dave's eyebrows shot up. He whistled low. "Angelica Rose. Jesus, Viv. I remember that one. The art collector. That case drove you crazy. Why are you digging that up now?" I couldn't tell him the whole truth. Not yet. The words, "she's engaged to my son," were too monstrous to speak out loud. "I have a source," I lied, the deception tasting like ash in my mouth. "A credible tip. I think she might have resurfaced." It was enough. The hunt was the hunt, and a chance to close a decade-old case was a powerful motivator. "All right," he said, his eyes gleaming with a renewed sense of purpose. "Let's go see what we can find." He led me down to the archives, a windowless, fluorescent-lit room in the basement of the precinct, a veritable catacomb of the city's forgotten tragedies. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and dust. This was where cases came to die, their stories confined to cardboard boxes and manila folders. Dave found the right section and pulled down a box labeled SVU Cold Cases 2010-2015. He placed it on a metal table and we began to sift through the files. And there it was, a folder slightly thicker than the others, with 2 words written on the tab in my own, familiar handwriting, Angelica Rose. My heart pounded as Dave opened the file. It was all there, just as I remembered it. The typed-up victim statement from Alistair Finch, his words a painful testament to his betrayal. The crime scene photos of his ransacked apartment, the list of dead-end leads, and the surveillance photo, the grainy black and white image of a young woman in a scarf, her face turned martially towards the camera. Even with the poor quality, The bone structure was unmistakable. It was her. I took out one of the photos I had taken of Gabrielle, outside the Chelsea restaurant. I placed it on the table next to the old surveillance image. The woman in my photo was older, more sophisticated, but she was, without a single shred of a doubt, the same person. Dave stared at the two pictures, his jaw slowly dropping. "Holy hell, Viv," he whispered. "It's after all this time. It's really her." The confirmation was a cold, grim satisfaction. I was not crazy. My instincts had been right, and now I had the proof. The ghost had a name, a new name, and I knew exactly where to find her. Staring at the contents of the cold case file spread out under the harsh fluorescent lights of the archive room, was like looking at a blueprint for my son's destruction. The modus operandi, detailed in the dry, clinical language of the police reports, was a chillingly perfect match. Angelica Rose targeted successful, established men, men with assets, men who were for one reason or another emotionally vulnerable. A decade ago it had been a wealthy grieving widower. Today it was a celebrated successful chef, a man whose heart was wide open. The pattern was undeniable. Michael wasn't a soulmate she had stumbled upon by chance. He was a target she had acquired. The art consultant story was her key, her way into his world. It gave her a plausible reason to be at gallery openings, to move in the same social circles as men like him. It provided her with a veneer of culture and sophistication, a perfect camouflage for her predatory nature. I looked at the old financial reports from the Finch case, the evidence of accounts drained, of assets liquidated and funneled into untraceable offshore accounts. My blood ran cold as I thought of Michael's restaurant. Aperture. It was his life's work, the culmination of his dreams, a thriving, valuable business that he had built from the ground up. To him it was a passion. To her, I now realized, it was a multi-million-dollar asset waiting to be stripped. The fear that had been a dull ache in my chest now sharpened into a bright, terrifying point. This wasn't just about a broken heart. This was about my son's entire future, his financial security, everything he had worked for. And then a darker thought surfaced. A memory of a detail from the original report. The accomplice. The violent, brutal man who had beaten Alistair Finch while Angelica watched. Where was he? Was he still part of her life? A silent partner in her cons? Was he waiting in the wings for the moment when Michael was no longer useful, no longer compliant? The thought of my son, my kind, gentle son, being in the same room as a man like that, let alone being at his mercy, was a horror beyond anything I could imagine. The stakes of my investigation had just been raised exponentially. This was no longer just about exposing a liar. This was about extricating my son from a situation of extreme and immediate danger. I knew with the certainty of a detective who has seen the worst of human nature, that a direct confrontation was the most dangerous move I could make. Cornering an animal as cunning and as desperate as Angelica would be a fatal mistake. She would lie. She would manipulate. She would turn Michael against me even more fiercely. She might even panic and run, taking whatever she could from Michael before she disappeared, perhaps even hurting him in the process. I could not let that happen. I had to be smarter. I had to be more patient. I had to create a situation where Michael could see the truth for himself. A situation so undeniable that even his love-blinded eyes would be forced open. I needed to do more than just tell him who she was. I needed to show him. I needed to bring her past crashing into her present. Right in front of him, the plan began to form in my mind. A risky and deeply painful piece of emotional theater. It would be the hardest thing I had ever done as a mother and the most important thing I had ever done as a detective. I needed a ghost from her past to unmask her, and I knew exactly which one to call. The first step was to find Alistair Finch. It was a delicate operation. I couldn't use official police channels. Not yet. I didn't want to create a digital footprint that might somehow tip off Angelica. I called in another favor, this time from a retired records clerk I had known for years. A woman who knew how to navigate the city's databases with a quiet, discreet efficiency. Within a day, she had an address for me. Mr. Finch was no longer living in his Upper East Side penthouse. The financial devastation had been too complete. He was now a resident of a quiet, modest retirement community in Westchester. The drive up to the facility was filled with a grim, somber sense of purpose. I remembered Mr. Finch as a man of vitality and pride, even after the assault. The man I met in the sunny antiseptic common room of the retirement home was a ghost of his former self. He was in a wheelchair, his body made frail by the intervening decade and the lingering effects of his injuries. But his mind, I was relieved to find, was still sharp. His eyes, though clouded with age, widened slightly as he recognized me. "Detective Sterling," he said, his voice a soft, papery whisper. "I never thought I would see you again." We sat in a quiet corner of the garden, the air filled with the scent of roses. I didn't beat around the bush. I told him gently but directly that I had found her. The color drained from his face. His hand, which was resting on the arm of his wheelchair, began to tremble. "Angelica," he breathed, the name a curse on his lips. I saw a decade of pain, of humiliation, of unresolved trauma, flicker in his eyes. He had been forced to live with the knowledge that the people who had destroyed his life were out there, free, and likely doing the same to others. I explained the situation. I told him about my son. I watched as his expression shifted from fear to a kind of profound, sorrowful empathy. He more than anyone understood the insidious nature of her poison. I then laid out my plan. It was a terrible thing to ask of him. I was asking him to confront the monster from his worst nightmares, to relive the most traumatic event of his life. He was silent for a long time, his gaze distant, his frail hands gripping the arms of his chair. I thought he was going to refuse, and I wouldn't have blamed him. But then he looked at me and I saw a new light in his eyes, a flicker of the proud, strong man he used to be. It was a look of pure, steely resolve. "She took everything from me, Detective," he said, his voice gaining a measure of its old strength. "My money, my health, my wife's memory. She cannot be allowed to do that to your son. She cannot be allowed to win again." He took a deep, shaky breath. "I will do it," he said. "Whatever you need, I will help you." The relief that washed over me was so immense it almost brought me to my tears. I had my bait. Now all I had to do was set the trap. The next phase of the operation required a performance of my own, one that rivaled any of Gabrielle's. I had to become the woman my son wanted me to be, the loving, accepting, and slightly defeated mother. I waited 2 days, giving myself time to steel my nerves and rehearse my lines. Then I called him. My voice when I spoke was a carefully calibrated instrument of warmth and reconciliation. I told him I had done a lot of thinking. I apologized for being difficult, for not understanding. I told him that his happiness was the most important thing in the world to me, and that I would not stand in its way. I accepted his decision about the wedding, and I wished him and Gabrielle all the best. The relief in his voice was so pure, so absolute. It was like a physical blow. "Oh, Mon," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. That means everything to me. I knew you'd understand." He had no idea what I was about to do, and the guilt was a cold, heavy stone in my stomach, but it was a necessary cruelty. "As a wedding gift," I continued, my voice bright and cheerful, "I'd like to take you and Gabrielle out to a proper dinner, to celebrate. No pressure, no big family scene, just the three of us. My treat, my blessing." He agreed immediately, enthusiastically. He was so happy to have his mother back, so relieved that the conflict was over, that he didn't question it for a second. He spoke to Gabrielle, who I could hear in the background was cautiously receptive. My surrender had lowered her defenses. She no longer saw me as a threat, but as a problem that had been solved. We set a date for the following evening. I chose the restaurant with a strategist's care, an old-school Italian place in the West Village called La Stella, known for its quiet, intimate atmosphere and its dim, forgiving lighting. It was a place where a scene could unfold without attracting too much attention. The next evening, I arrived at the restaurant half an hour early, with Mr. Finch. My old partner Dave had helped arrange for a discreet medical transport, and Mr. Finch was now sitting opposite me at a secluded corner table, looking distinguished in a dark suit, his wheelchair tucked neatly to one side. The tension in the air between us was thick and palpable. He was nervous, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes were filled with a grim determination. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "You are a very brave man, Alistair," I said softly. He simply nodded, his jaw set. We waited in silence, two soldiers in a quiet foxhole, waiting for the battle to begin. At 8 o'clock sharp they arrived. I saw them through the restaurant's etched glass door before they saw me. They were laughing, Michael's arm draped possessively around Gabrielle's shoulders. They looked radiant, invincible, the perfect image of a couple in love. My heart ached. This was the last time I would ever see my son look so happy, so carefree. They stepped inside, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. Michael spotted me and his face broke into a wide, relieved smile. He led Gabrielle towards our table. "Mom," he said, his voice full of warmth, "This is so great of you." Gabrielle offered me a smile that was a masterpiece of polite, victorious charm. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Vivian," she said, her voice as smooth and as cool as silk. I stood up, my own face a carefully constructed mask of maternal warmth. "The pleasure is all mine," I said. I then gestured to the quiet, elderly man sitting at the table. "Michael, Gabby," I said, my voice as calm and as even as I could make it. "Before we order, I'd like you to meet an old friend of mine. This is Alistair Finch." Time seemed to slow down, to stretch and warp in the silent, breath-held moment that followed my introduction. For a fraction of a second, Gabrielle's polite smile remained frozen on her face, a beautiful, meaningless facade. Her eyes flickered towards the elderly man in the wheelchair with the casual, dismissive glance one gives to a stranger. Michael, still beaming, opened his mouth to offer a pleasantry, but the words never came. Alistair Finch looked up. His gaze, which had been fixed on the white tablecloth, lifted to meet the face of the woman who had haunted his life for 10 years. His eyes, though clouded by age and time, widened. A tremor ran through his frail body. A sound, a small choked gasp, escaped his lips. He recognized her, instantly, irrevocably. He saw past the dark hair, past the expensive dress, past the decade of reinvention, and he saw the angel who had destroyed him. "Angelica," he whispered. The name was not loud. It was a soft, trembling ghost of a sound. But in the quiet intimacy of our corner table, it landed with the force of a bomb. Gabrielle's face, which had been a portrait of sophisticated charm, shattered. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a waxy, ashen pallor. Her brilliant blue eyes, which had been so full of cool confidence, now widened in pure animal terror. The mask did not just slip, it was violently ripped away, revealing the panicked, cornered con artist beneath. Her body went rigid. Her hand, which had been resting on Michael's arm, flew to her throat in a gesture of pure primal shock. Michael stared, his own smile collapsing, his face a canvas of utter confusion. He looked from the terrified old man to the chalk-white, guilty face of the woman he loved. "What?" he stammered, his voice a confused croak. "What did he call you? Who's Angelica?" But Gabrielle couldn't answer. She was trapped, impaled on the point of Alistair's recognition. Her mind, so quick, so brilliant at deception, was short-circuiting. There was no lie she could tell, no story she could spin, that could explain away the raw, undeniable terror on her face. I don't know what he's talking about," she finally managed to choke out, her voice a thin, reedy thing he had never heard before. "He's mistaken. I've never seen him before in my life." But it was too late. The lie was transparent, pathetic. The evidence of her guilt was written all over her. Michael's confusion began to curdle into a dawning, sickening horror. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading question, and for the first time he saw not a jealous mother but a detective who had been trying to warn him all along. The beautiful dream he had been living in was collapsing around him, and he was finally terribly awake. The stranger sitting next to him, the woman with the face of a terrified ghost, was not the Gabrielle he loved. He had no idea who she was. The tableau held for another frozen, silent moment. The terrified con artist, the heartbroken son, the ghost of a victim, and the detective who had orchestrated their reunion. Then, as if on a silent cue, two men who had been sitting at the bar stood up and began to walk towards our table. One of them was my old partner, Dave Miller. They moved with a quiet, professional purpose, their faces grim and unreadable. Gabrielle saw them coming, and a low, wounded sound escaped her throat. The last vestiges of her fight dissolved. She knew the game was over. "Angelica Rose, also known as Gabrielle Dubois," Dave said, his voice calm, official, and devoid of any emotion. "You're under arrest for grand larceny, assault, and fraud." He didn't even need to read her rights. She simply slumped in her chair, a puppet with its strings cut, her face a mask of utter abject defeat. There was no scene, no screaming, no resistance. The patrons of La Stella barely noticed as she was quietly escorted from the restaurant, her decade of freedom ending not with a bang, but with the quiet final click of handcuffs. The cold case was, at long last, closed. I turned my attention to my son. Michael was still standing, his body rigid with shock, his face as pale as Gabrielle's had been. He stared at the empty chair where she had been sitting, his world reduced to a single vacant space. He looked as though he had been hollowed out, as if his very soul had been scooped from his body, leaving behind an empty, shell-shocked vessel. Alistair Finch was weeping silently into his hands, a decade of suppressed grief and anger finally being released. I put a hand on his shoulder, then gently guided my son, who was moving like a sleepwalker, out of the restaurant and into the cool night air. The days that followed were a blur of quiet, painful conversations and long, heavy silences. We retreated to the sanctuary of my Brooklyn brownstone. The world outside held at bay. Michael was broken. His heart, his trust, his entire perception of his own life had been shattered. He learned the whole ugly story of Alistair Finch, of the violence, of the cold, calculated nature of the woman he had been prepared to marry. He was not just heartbroken, he was humiliated, consumed by a shame so profound he could barely speak. But beneath the grief and the shame, something else was beginning to grow, a quiet, dawning and profound sense of gratitude. He was beginning to understand that the pain he was feeling now, as excruciating as it was nothing compared to the lifetime of pain he had been saved from. A week after the arrest, we were sitting in my study, a comfortable silence between us. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Michael, who had barely looked me in the eye for days, finally turned to me. His own eyes were clear, filled not with anger but with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "All that time," he said, his voice quiet and raspy, "you knew, you were trying to protect me, and I pushed you away, I hurt you. You were in love, Michael," I said softly. "She was a professional. She fooled men far more worldly than you." He shook his head, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. "She didn't fool you," he said. He looked around my quiet, book-filled study, at the woman sitting across from him, and I think for the first time in his life, he saw me not just as his mother, but as the woman I truly was. A protector, a hunter, a quiet warrior who had gone into battle one last time for him. The chasm that Gabrielle had created between us was gone. In its place was a new, stronger and more honest foundation. My son was safe. The ghost of my most haunting case was finally at rest. I was, at long last, retired. The end. Thank you for watching.